Hello. The literary devices and mechanisms of wordplay that we'll be learning about during this week's and next week's classes depend on the idea of sentences and clauses. Now, you don't need to obviously know the difference between a dependent and an independent clause or a complete sentence or an incomplete sentence in order to understand these devices, but knowing all of this will be a useful foundation. So let's start here. Let's start with our sample sentence, noun, verbs, noun. This is a full sentence. On its own, it's complete. In this sentence, we have two nouns, noun and noun, obviously, but there's also a verb, which connects noun number one to noun number two. That said, the two nouns aren't interchangeable. We can see this if we swap out our normal sentence with a sample sentence, Jimmy ate a pickle. Our sample sentence, like the original one, has two nouns, Jimmy and a pickle. Jimmy, this is a side note, is what we would call a proper noun. There's a lot of different types of proper nouns, such as names, places, or organizations. Our other noun, a pickle, has two subparts. There's what's called an indefinite article. This is contrasted, of course, to what's called a definite article, such as this, that, the, that kind of thing. If you take Spanish or French or know a different language, maybe you know it as, el pickle versus un pickle. Obviously, I don't know the word in Spanish or French for pickle, but you get my point. The a in English, or the, or the this, or the that substitutes for the article. So again, our two nouns are Jimmy and a pickle. We go one way. The sentence can't go the other way, though. We can't swap out a pickle and say he ate Jimmy. Even though we have noun and noun, we can see that the placement around the verb indicates that the nouns aren't functionally equivalent. Let's simplify again. In order to distinguish between the first noun and the second noun, we can call one the subject and one the object, based on their placement with respect to the verb. We can say that the noun is the subject of the sentence, and then the verb's noun, that's what's called the predicate of the sentence. Now, we say the word predicate to distinguish it from the subject because some predicates don't have an object. So this is why I've written here, the predicate usually equals verb plus an object. Now, again, not all verbs have an object. In this case, Jimmy is our subject, and ate a pickle is our predicate. Obviously, a pickle is the object of the verb ate. Now, again, I said sometimes predicates don't necessarily have objects. Ate is what's called an intransitive verb. You don't necessarily need to have an object with the verb ate. Regardless of whether or not a verb is transitive or intransitive, though, you can always remember that the sentence in which a verb appears always has a subject and a predicate. As a side note, the distinction between transitive and intransitive verbs is rather straightforward to remember. If you have trouble, you can always Google it, of course. I always think of transitive verbs as the verb requires an object in order to put the subject into transit, if that makes sense. The intransitive verb doesn't need to put anything into transit. The subject can simply verb. Again, you don't necessarily need to understand the distinction between a transitive and intransitive verb. You just need to keep in mind, as in our sample sentence, that we always have a subject and a predicate. Let's review all of this on our straightforward sample sentence. Again, all of this is what we would call a full sentence. We have our subject here, and then we also have our predicate. Our verb, in this case, is a transitive verb, but again, we can also have an intransitive verb. If we have an intransitive verb, our sample sentence would just be noun, verbs. Again, we have a subject and a predicate. This is also what we would call a full sentence. In order to lump both of these things together, we can think of both of these things as complete thoughts. If a subject plus a predicate constitutes a complete thought, it's called an independent clause. This is in distinction to dependent clauses, which don't necessarily have all three of these things. If we add on the word although to the front of both of these chunks, we get two sentences that don't really sound like complete thoughts. Although noun, verbs, noun, although noun, verbs. The word that we've added, although, is called a dependent marker word. It's one of many dependent marker words. The most common ones you've probably heard of are if, although, like ours. You can also say since, and unless or until. If you swap out if, which is of course another dependent marker word, for the one that we've used, which is although, the two chunks still sound like they're not complete. If noun verbs noun, if noun verbs. In both of these instances, we expect something else to happen, but nothing ever does. They're both incomplete thoughts. This is why they end in commas, not in periods. We'll go over in a later lesson how and when to use commas when pairing dependent and independent clauses. What's important to note right now, though, is that both of these incomplete thoughts contain subjects and predicates. This is useful because when attempting to diagnose a clause, to decide, in other words, whether it's a dependent or an independent clause, we can't just look for subjects and predicates. We have to look at whether or not the chunk is a complete or an incomplete thought. Independent clauses are complete thoughts, whereas dependent clauses, as we've seen, are incomplete thoughts. Generally speaking, dependent clauses will be set off or somehow associated with one of those dependent marker words that we reviewed. That's all for now, but I would encourage you to click the video just beneath this one to practice identifying all of the different parts of sentences and clauses we've discussed here.